I'm giving this one 4 donuts, 4 good donuts.
4 good donuts. Well, you'd struggle to find that in Canada. It's all like weird sugary shit at the fucking Tim Hortons. I can't say that. The YT Capra Core 1 is an alloy version of its one-winged carbon Capra counterpart. The mixed-wheeled bike looks to balance geometry figures, albeit with not the most progressive values on test. That said, it does offer a well-rounded spec from the German powerhouse. But how did this bike get on? Well, we spoke to Cario and Dazimer to find out. So those are the details, but let's talk about how this YT Capra rides. Now, this is arguably the burliest bike on test with that mixed wheel platform, but it's also the heaviest. So what's it like getting this bike to the top of the hill?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that weight. You do notice it. This bike is almost 37 pounds, so it's not your super light, sprinty trail bike, but it's manageable. And after time, that kind of fades to the background. As far as the way the suspension feels when you're climbing, it's on the more active side, but not crazy active. It doesn't have any climb switch on the shock, so there's nothing to flip, so you don't have to worry about that. I probably would have used one occasionally if it was there, but it's not, I wouldn't say that's a deal breaker or something that was like, it absolutely needs one, but you know, put it middle of the road as far as efficiency goes.
Well, middle of the road is probably quite a good way to summarize this bike. I mean, the geometry is by no means outdated, but it's not as perhaps progressive as some other bikes, 464 reach for a large.
Yeah.
How does the geometry play into its climbing, Dario?
I mean, it has a plenty steep seat-tube angle, like steepest on test. We had it in the low position for the most part, so that's like 60-40 degree head angle and 77.5 seat. I didn't think it felt too outdated in that way at all. In fact, the reach is quite short though. It's almost 20 mil shorter than some of the longer bikes on test.
And does that affect, because you know we see some of these bikes that actually have really long effective top tubes, that seat to position climbing can sometimes be quite unwieldy. How does the Capra feel in the seat position?
It feels tight, but not bad. Like I didn't think it was uncomfortable or like cramped feeling because it has a pretty long wheelbase, given like the slack angles and reasonably long chain stays. Like that shorter cockpit kind of helps you navigate some tighter sections of trail. It did feel to me like a seated climber relative to stuff like the Status, where like I found myself standing up on it a lot. Like the Capra was comfortable to just sit down and pedal.
But some bikes do have that feel of firm underfoot efficiency, and then some do track a little bit better. Which camp would you put this one in, Kaz?
I think I'd put it more in that tracking camp, just because you do have that extra travel, I think. So some of the shorter travel ones, they just feel a little firmer off the top. Where this one, plush is gonna be too strong a word. Again, it's kind of that middle of the road feel. So I think the shock tune matches pretty well for the bike for climbing and descending. We'll get into that in a bit, but I think that the overall efficiency isn't something that I'm gonna complain about when it comes time to climb.
And it never like plunges through travel on the climbs. Like you sometimes with long travel bikes, like you'll hit a bump and find yourself like sagging into it, and this doesn't do that too much.
So onto the descending, which is the bit that, well, a lot of people really care about. And actually looking at this bike, I imagine that's what potential buyers of the Capra will be really focused on. Going back to the geometry again, Kaz, this isn't the most progressive bike, but it is certainly slack enough. Let's talk about its descending. Was it the most capable bike on test?
It's not the most capable bike on test. It definitely has the most travel, but I think there's another bike that we're gonna talk about, that Status, and that's probably the most capable. But this one it does a good job as far as if you want to tackle rough terrain, you've got plenty of travel. It does give you the feeling of being a little more on top of the bike rather than in the bike. I don't even like the term in the bike too much, but if that helps explain, you're kind of above it more just because of that shorter reach. It's very manageable, really easy to do some two-wheel drifts, but you're not getting that fully like locked in, long, stable feel from it.
But if we could just compare it to that Status, because these are the bikes on test which have more travel. But where that bike has got a super short rear end and a very long reach, this bike could arguably be said to be more balanced. Did it feel like a balanced composed bike on trail in terms of flatter turns perhaps?
Yeah, as far as geometry goes, I think that geometry is quite balanced because you are just kind of more centered, and like that two-wheel drift sensation I was talking about, I think that is because you're in the middle, so you can kind of let it break free and kind of bring it back in a real predictable manner.
And I think the Capra might be a better race bike than the Status in a lot of conditions, just because the slightly steeper head angle, more balanced geo, lets it track better in flatter corners. Like that Status, like that wheel is pretty far in front of you, and I think was tricky in some circumstances.
If we talk about riding styles then, because something like that Status, getting drawn into it, but that might require, could it be said, a more sort of grab it by the scruff of the neck riding style, where the longer stays on this bike will essentially put more weight on the front wheel, which could make it feel more neutral. Would that be fair to say?
I thought it felt balanced. And then like, it's worth noting too, like this wasn't a super plowy feeling bike. Like despite being 170 mil travel, like I thought it was poppy and pretty fun. Part of that is cause the reach is so short. It is like quite easy to move around.
And how does the suspension feel play into that then? We talked about being middle of the road in terms of tracking efficiency. Does it hug the ground or does it kind of skim over the top?
It's, again, somewhere kind of between the two.
Yeah,
like
it's fairly progressive in the end of the stroke, so I think you're getting some pop from that. So as you go deeper, it doesn't really just blow through the end of the travel. They're pretty strong ramp up, so I think that does give it some pop, which may decrease the amount. Like it's a 170 bike, but doesn't feel like a huge waterbed of a bike. So I think somebody that might want something with more travel than their terrain might necessarily warrant, it would be a good one for that.
Yeah.
So for me, the way you describe this bike, I'm thinking of it as well-rounded, sort of a do-it-all bike that's not necessarily extreme in any one regard, but it's actually quite middle of the road in many.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She also mentioned that we were testing it in the low setting. So if you wanted to steepen it up, which we never felt the need to steepen it up, but somebody could even steepen it up to wake up its handling a little bit more if that's what they're wanting. If they wanted a bike with a lot of travel, but maybe not necessarily the slackest thing out there.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the components, because we've got a lot to get through on this bike. First of all, I mentioned over the course of the week that you guys have been saying that seat post was a little bit on the short side. It also has those new DB8 brakes from SRAM. So let's start with the seat post, Dario. How dimensionally did this bike fit, both in terms of seat post, bars, stem? Was there any outliers that you thought weren't quite right?
As you said, the seat post, the dropper is a bit short. That's going to run into some issues with like how this frame is going to size for certain people. Because the reach is relatively short, I imagine a lot of people will size up, but the seat tube gets quite long when you do that. So there's going to be some sizing challenges with that.
So for reference, Kaz, you're 5'11", you're just above 6 foot, and you've both been riding that large frame. You could arguably both be riding the XL, which I think has an extra 20 mil of reach. However, that seat tube length is going to grow, which could put you in a difficult position in terms of clearance.
Yeah, I think if I sized up and went with the XL, I wouldn't be able to run a really long travel dropper post. I typically like to run a 200 mil post, and that size XL has a 470 millimeter seat tube length, which is quite long. So that's what you run into. If you try to size up, there's not quite as much range.
I mean, to be fair, like I think all the bikes here had relatively short dropper posts.
Which you find on the budget bikes, right?
Right, which is like a funny thing to me. Like realistically, they don't cost a ton different, but
Well, you know how tubes get exponentially more expensive.
yeah, it's just so
tube is
hard.
very cheap, but
It's a
175
long
whoa,
stanchion.
breaks the ceiling.
Yeah, on this bike, I did find myself dropping the seat a little bit extra. Like I'd undo that 4 mil, push the post down a bit if I was riding anything super steep. But for the most part, I was having a fine time. Part of it is like because that reach is so short, you're kind of tall on the bike anyway. And so you don't need quite as much drop to account for like handling over the bike.
So let's talk about handling and how these components play into that. First of all, with descending, it's got a sort of SRAM finishing kit with rock shocks and these SRAM DB8 brakes. What were the component standouts for you, for good or bad, Dario, that made you think, actually this really shines, or perhaps it's holding this bike back a little bit?
This is my first time riding SRAM's DB8 brakes. That's their mineral oil variant of the Code. I thought they were good. Like they felt a lot like a Code does. Bite point was consistent. Seems like they're easy to work on, and they didn't change too much over the course of the test. Suspension was a bit more of a mixed bag, but I'll let Kaz handle that.
Yeah, mixed bag kind of describes it pretty accurately. I found the fork to be really active, wanted to go pretty deep in its stroke, and that didn't quite match as much with the rear shock feel. Like I mentioned before, the rear shock is fairly progressive, so you kind of have it ramping up towards the end of its travel, where the fork didn't do that as much. You could compensate for that with some extra volume spacers in the fork, but the overall balance isn't quite there, and your adjustments on the fork are fairly limited. You just have a low speed compression dial that's pretty coarse adjustments. It's a little bit harder to get that nice even balance, but I'd say overall the suspension components can handle big hits. They're predictable to a certain point. Like when you're really charging, really hitting repeated big bumps, there sometimes could be a little bit of a strange rebound feel.
But it's a trade-off. I mean, this is a good value bike.
Yeah, exactly.
It's $2,700, and you're getting a lot of bike for money, and you're not going to get the World Cup level suspension.
No, not at all. And for what you're getting, again, it's super capable. You could just ride this in the bike park and be confident that the suspension components could handle what you're throwing at it.
Yeah.
One last thing before we go into, talk about the overall of the bike. We spoke a lot about how these components affect descending. Mm-hmm. Were there any standouts or concerns on the parts for climbing? How was that drivetrain?
The drivetrain is bad. I mean, in a word, like NX does the job. I think certain variants of NX are better. We'll talk about that later with some other bikes. Like the shifter feels quite spongy, and I actually had it break on me on the first ride. Like the ratchet mechanism in it just stripped out, just riding along. I mean, to use the phrase.
And it's funny, it's a double-edged sword because we say $2,700. It's not that much when we talk about suspension, but for that much money, you'd hope to have a reliable group set.
When you get into this realm of budget bike, I think you can get good copies of a component and bad copies of a component. So it's entirely possible that like this shifter was just a bit of a lemon, but luckily that's the kind of thing a bike shop should be able to fix, and like YT would probably just replace as a warranty item if it's on the first ride, I would hope.
Yeah,
but
you'd hope so.
Just to say, like, there are definitely some reliability issues with the NX drivetrain. I think they get kind of beat up pretty quickly.
So, pros, starting with you, Dario, what are the positives of this bike?
I think the main positive for me is just how well-rounded it is, considering it is like the biggest travel and the heaviest bike on test. I found it was really fun on trail in a lot of circumstances, but you could push it a little bit harder. I think there are some solid component choices on this bike, like the brakes are nice, and I think the suspension does work quite well for what it is. And then I think the frame itself is pretty high quality. Like we didn't have too many issues with like bolts coming loose or any weird stuff like that.
So, Kaz, it sounds like we've got a bike which is quite well-rounded, which definitely, to me at least, bleeds into good value because it opens up the capabilities, and maybe having a frame that's worthy of potential upgrades. But what are the cons of this bike?
I think for the cons, I think sizing could be a little tricky for some riders depending on your height and your preference. You know, we did mention the reach is a bit short, and so some riders may want to size up, but if they do that, they might run into that C-tube length, so you can't run as long of a dropper post. So kind of more of a sizing thing. It's not the end of the world, but just something to be aware of if you're familiar with what numbers you like. Another con has to do more with components. We mentioned that shorter travel dropper post, and then also the NX drivetrain with that broken shifter. So they're just component-related cons that you may run into issues with those.
So it's time to deliver our verdict. Now, this being the value bike field test, we need to compare the value of these bikes as well. So out of 5 donuts, Kaz, how many does the Capra get?
I'm gonna give it 4 donuts, and these are good donuts, not your cheap like grocery store donuts. These are solid, high quality donuts.
From a donut shop.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what does it represent in terms of value?
I mean, your frame that you're starting with, it's a good frame, worthy of upgrading in the future if you wanted to, and then the part spec that it comes with, suspension, brakes, those are all really good too. So I think that overall, not a lot that needs to be upgraded, solid choice.
Ready to rip. And Dario, who's this bike for?
I think this would be a pretty solid purchase for someone who wants to maybe do a couple races a year, isn't like dead set on that being a, every weekend activity.
Podium finishing, they're just getting out there having fun.
Just like going out for a race that's capable, but wants a like relatively long travel bike they can ride on most trails and have a good time. It's not going to be overgunned for too much, and you should be able to push it pretty hard.
So there we go. That is the YT Capra. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to stay tuned for all the field test videos.